Okay, hello chat. Good afternoon or evening for those of you elsewhere in the world just now. We should be all live now. Says the connection's good as well. I know there's a bit of a lag between my talking and what you guys can hear. So when you start hearing this, could somebody just say in the chat and kind of say what the quality is like for you guys. If you've got a blank screen, that's absolutely fine. I don't really have the bandwidth to do video, I'm afraid, so we're just gonna have to do this via audio. Okay, so I've run a couple of these sort of live tutorial streams last week. Uh, Tom, all clear, can hear everything well. Excellent, that's great. Thanks for that, Tom. So I've run a couple of these last week, and basically the best way to do it I've found is I'll do a bit of talking, and you guys just sort of post your comments, your questions, and stuff in the chat, and feel free to talk to one another in the chat as well, and address one another's points. But this really relies on you guys being quite active, and I'll try and kind of answer questions, respond to comments, and generally just sort of fill the dead air where I can. But especially because there's such a small group as well, because obviously the course is quite small, so I'm really relying on you guys to basically just carpet bomb the chat with points, questions, observations, anything that you find interesting as well. Any of that kind of stuff. We'll do this for about an hour. I'll send an announcement out, but I'll be running this is how we'll run the revision class as well. So I'll give you an update over my Aberdeen as to when that one will be happening, so you can all log in and get that as well. Okay. So, what did you guys think of the lecture? Do you have any thoughts, comments, questions, anything like that? Just ask away or make your points. And we'll kind of try and run this as normally as possible. By the way, I noticed after the fact there are a few typos in the PowerPoint. My apologies about that. I kind of rapidly expanded this lecture in a hurry to get as much extra information in there, so it would complement for not having an audible lecture to go along with it. But I ought to proofread it a little bit better, so I do apologise there. And if there's anything that you want to raise from the lecture that you need me to expand upon or clarify, again, just all of this, just drop all of this in the chat. And of course, I hope you're all doing very, very well. I hope you're all safe and riding out the pandemic as best you can. Good stuff for those of you who got home, and a bit of a shame for those of you who are here on exchange programs. This hasn't been like the best semester abroad I could imagine, especially with getting sent home relatively early, with a lot of it still to go. So sorry about that for you guys. Tom J, I was wondering if we could get a more robust explanation for what are black swans. Oh, okay, fair enough. Yeah, that's an excellent point. So a black swan event is a kind of a colloquial term for an unexpected and very influential event, which kind of like comes seemingly out of nowhere. So when looking at the future in terms of assessing risk and assessing geopolitics, there are three categories of event, right? I believe I've explained this in the lecture once before, but I'll do so again for the benefit of anybody who couldn't make it. Um, so a known known is something which is reliable and predictable, and as far as we can anticipate, is something which will happen. So for example, if there's an election scheduled in a country, as there is in the United States for November, it's a known known to say that there will be an election this year. It's planned. It's as knowable as can be. A known unknown, which is the second category, is something which is not inevitable and may not even be particularly likely, but is a definite probability and needs to be kind of guarded against or prepared for. So a known unknown might be the possibility of a conflict arising. Nobody can always predict when or where kind of a conflict will come from, but if there's markers like high tensions, serious diplomatic disputes, potentially even kind of low-lying or low-level confrontation like economic sanctions and so on, that would come under the bracket of kind of known unknown, and nations and actors generally prepare for this. So they might enhance their readiness, they might prepare additional forces, they might prepare diplomatic strategies, and so on and so forth. An unknown unknown, which is the third category and which black swan events fall into, is the kind of thing that just rears up out of nowhere and captures everybody by surprise. There might have been a sort of a vague knowledge that such a thing could happen, but it's so remote and unpredictable that it's really impossible to prepare for it, and it generally surprises people when they do. Now, an obvious example of this is the current pandemic we're experiencing. This is realistically, we are living through a black swan event at the moment. Whilst the possibility of a pandemic, it wasn't impossible. People knew this could happen. The timing and the scale of these events is so fundamentally unpredictable that when they do happen, they cause intense shock to the system, and it generally tends to be kind of very high impact and quite long lasting. And COVID-19 really sort of ticks all of the boxes for this. It kind of emerges out of nowhere, really. It very sort of rapidly spreads. It kind of becomes clear that it's going to be a pandemic, that it's going to kind of spread all around the world as it has. And one thing that I would say with some degree of confidence is that the economic impacts are going to be every bit as profound as kind of the health impacts in terms of the individuals who are going to get it, and indeed the kind of the fatalities as well. Because as you're all aware, Europe, North America, China, large parts of Asia have basically locked down. Productivity has gone down. Unprecedented measures have been taken to try and manage it. So yeah, so if does that answer your question, Tom? Is that kind of a good explanation of what a black swan is? The 2008 crash as well would be considered a black swan because again it came out of nowhere and had enormous effects. Ditto the Great Depression. In fact, really most sort of crises that kind of have very sudden onsets and kind of weren't really predicted at the time can be ascribed as kind of black swans. Excellent. Good. Glad that answered it. And yeah, anyone else? Just any comments, questions? Just keep dropping them in, and we'll have a good chat. Let's see if there's anything to pull up just while I'm waiting for a few more of you guys to respond. It's a bit of a shame. Well, it is an enormous shame on a whole bunch of different levels that we didn't get to do the last tutorial live, because the last tutorial of this course was meant to be a crisis simulation, which sort of really would cover the creation and the process of a crisis. And how it usually runs is I would be an actor, say Russia, and I would split you guys up into one of you would be NATO, one of you would be the US, one of you would be the kind of the government of the nation state concerned. And the idea is what I do kind of depends on what you guys how you guys react, and we run through it for an hour and sort of negotiate this crisis. I was racking my brains of ways we could maybe do it remotely, but I just don't think it would work. You kind of need to be in the same room at the same time. But if you ever get the chance to do that kind of exercise, it's really quite fun. Simonis, would the Crimea annexation be considered a black swan? That's an interesting one. So the thing with the Crimea annexation, there's good reasons to suggest it was, in that it was very, very sudden, and it certainly changed the game in kind of Eastern Europe, especially from a perception point of view. You know, this kind of took this 25 years at the time of strategic drift in NATO and completely consolidated it. It completely kind of changed the perceptions of the balance between kind of NATO and Russia and the states in the eastern flank, the former Soviet states. So in that sense, you could argue it was a bit of a black swan. On the other hand, the fact that after the deposing of Viktor Yanukovych, everyone knew sort of Russia was going to respond somehow, but the nature in which they did was quite surprising. So, yeah, on balance, I would consider the annexation of Crimea to be a bit of a black swan event. Although realistically, one of the other criteria for a black swan is it generally has large global ramifications. And whilst it's true, as I said, that there was some impact in terms of it changed a lot of people's perceptions, it was quite limited in terms of the global scale. Rebdi, a bit of a weird question, but what is the origin of the name Black Swan? I have no idea, is the simple answer to that, but I have the internet at my disposal, so I'm going to find that out. I think it's actually from an economics book. Well, according to the website blackswanevents.org, which, on the face of it seems a reasonable authority, the term black swan originates from the Western belief that all swans are white because these were the only ones accounted for. However, in 1697, the Dutch explorer Willem de Vlaming discovered black swans in Australia. This was an unexpected event in scientific history and profoundly changed zoology. Well, I can certainly believe that's a perfectly reasonable explanation for it. It seems very plausible. Plus, Google wouldn't lie to me, now would it? Ruth, what do you think the long-term global economic through political impact of COVID-19 will be? Well, that's a phenomenally good question. And how long have you got? In terms of precise predictions, no, I don't think it's possible to make those. But certainly there are going to be enormous ones. I mean, just starting with the economic side of things, this is kind of the greatest shock and shift to the economy that's happened really since to most economies, in fact, since the Second World War. And actually, I'm finding it harder and harder. I keep hearing this sort of phrase, "Oh, this never happened in peacetime before," and it's really hard to even walk down a street and sort of think of what we're living through as peacetime anymore. It's not really wartime either, but it's certainly something else. Um, and sort of a lot of the features of that kind of massive shock and wartime economy have come in, including kind of dramatic shifts in productivity, in this case dramatic drops in productivity, because only a certain percentage of economic activity can be done from home. And of course, we're seeing unprecedented bailout packages. The one in the US is enormous. I mean, while it's not been passed yet because there's a certain amount of political infighting over it going on at the moment, it's being talked of in the order of trillions. And likewise here, with the announcement that the government will just step in and pay 80% of wages to avoid layoffs, it's incredible. I've never seen a chancellor or a finance minister in my life sort of stand up and say there is no limit to the money we're going to throw at this. Now, that means, of course, but this is going to have to be paid for. So in the short term, we're going to see national debts explode. I think a lot of developed economies will be quite reluctant to raise taxes in order to try and compensate for this, because that might kind of slow down what will be a very sort of fragile at first economic recovery. In terms of how it might change kind of everything from sort of the kind of the macroeconomics to the microeconomics, it's going to be interesting to see how our work habits change as well. I think a lot of companies are going to realize that actually, whilst I've just said there's a limit to the amount of economic activity that can be done through working from home, I think one of the things this is going to show is that actually much more of it can be done from home than was thought possible before. So I imagine a lot of particularly kind of service industry companies will be thinking, well, why are we paying for these enormous office blocks, which are very expensive to build, very sort of expensive to maintain and run, when we can generate a lot of activity whilst people are kind of at home using basically their own power and their own internet and so on and so forth. So on the kind of micro level, I really see some big changes in attitude in terms of how we work. And as for politics, it's going to be hard to predict, but I really do think there are going to be enormous changes. To use kind of three examples that have been bubbling around my mind in the last few days, what the integrity of the Chinese state and the Chinese Communist Party will be after this is an interesting question. Whether or not there'll be kind of wider demonstrations, whether that will, even if there are, whether that will have any impact, will be worth watching. And sort of how China is going to basically pull itself out of this politically and economically will definitely be worth watching, because it's going to have ramifications for everyone. I think there's going to be an interesting effect on the secessionist movements that exist today. To use kind of Scotland as one example, I'm wondering if there will be kind of a slight, maybe a decline in nationalism, because there's, the response that's been required to kind of prevent mass unemployment and to react to this crisis would be far harder to achieve with a smaller state, with fewer resources at its disposal, and obviously much lower borrowing power as well. The only way that the government can really raise this without risking basically turning on the taps and printing money is borrowing a lot. And governments like the United Kingdom are in a great position to do that, because they have very high credit ratings, whereas newly founded states would not have that. So that might change attitudes. On the flip side of that, in the Canadian example, I mean, from what I've been able to gather, the Canadian federal government's more or less fallen to bits. It doesn't seem to have been terribly effective, and I suppose part of that having the kind of the Prime Minister in quarantine certainly doesn't help matters. But it seems that a lot of Canada's response to this has been coordinated at the provincial level. So whether this will, in the opposite to maybe the Scottish case, give the kind of Quebec independence movement, the nascent kind of Western separatist movement, a real boost in popularity because they're seeing examples of province-wide government actually being more effective than federal government. That could be entirely possible. And I could go on about this kind of for ages, so I'm just going to move on to another point just now. But yeah, it's safe to say there'll be enormous ones. And indeed, you guys, what do you think the political, the geopolitical, and the economic impacts will be about this? It'd be really great to get your guys' take on this. Whilst we didn't get to do what we were meant to be doing this week, to be honest, if we're talking about futures and we're talking about black swan events, we might as well make the best of a bad job and actually have a good discussion about the fact that we're living through one, and as students of politics and indeed students of history, I would hope we're all aware that we are living history right now. We're in a momentous point in time. So yeah, by all means, put your thoughts down. Tom, I don't know about Origin, but I'm sure it links to Black Swan too. Yeah. Right, D, we're now living in the crisis without the simulation. I mean, yeah, fair enough. Yeah, where's the need to simulate the irony of a crisis simulation being cancelled due to an actual crisis isn't lost on me. That's a fair point. Pavel, how important are Finland and Sweden to NATO's ability to provide deterrence against possible Russian aggression in the Baltic states? That's a very good question. I suppose in the general sense, the fact that Sweden and NATO aren't members of NATO but are very, very close to kind of NATO members, particularly in terms of bilateral links with the US, and the fact that both of them are EU member states as well, means that it gives the alliance kind of much more, much more room to maneuver, shall we say, in the Baltic Sea. It gives them kind of a greater flexibility in that regard, and kind of heightens the kind of credibility and capability of deterrence. If we're talking in a more sort of acute sense, if say in a time of crisis, it would help if short-term arrangements would allow NATO forces to use, say, Swedish and Finnish airspace and maritime space. That would be a tremendous help, and it would allow NATO to lock down more of the Eastern Mediterranean, as the Eastern Baltic. See, wrong one. There's a lot of seas flanking Europe. However, the problem would still remain that Russia has this enormous kind of anti-access area denial network built of things like air defense systems, of anti-ship and anti-land missiles, and it would make, and of course, the Russian Baltic Fleet. Now, while the surface fleet might not be able to compete with NATO's maritime advantage, submarines are still going to be an enormous risk. And not quite so little, but things like the fact that the Russian Navy still operates nuclear torpedoes means that you can do an awful lot of damage with one hit. So, whilst having kind of Finland and Sweden on side would be tremendously useful, it wouldn't ameliorate the problem of access which NATO would face in any kind of crisis surrounding the Baltics. Getting any sort of response into the Baltic states, even if it wasn't kind of a full-on invasion, even if it was, as we're seeing, kind of sponsored subversion, maybe with some use of kind of special forces or little green men, it would be very, very risky to reinforce the Baltic states, because it just could be so easily opposed and the kind of the resources and the troops in transit would be so vulnerable. I hope that's answered your question, but if there's anything else you wanted me to address, by all means say so. Just a quick note on the exam. As I said, I'll be running a revision live stream like this again, where we'll talk about the exam in a bit more depth. But just to keep you guys in the loop, the date is still yet to be confirmed. Third year exams are going ahead. First and second year assessments have been cancelled. And the reason it's going ahead for you guys is because honours students, obviously, your grades count towards your degree. So it's still important for you guys to be able to have the opportunity to take all of the assessments that you have scheduled. But the date will be confirmed, and basically it'll be a take-home thing. So I'll be posting the exam paper on the date of the exam, and then you guys will have a period of time to basically answer it. You'll upload your responses via via Turnitin, and the amount of time you'll have to do that, again, is to be confirmed. I'm pressing for a week. I'm not sure if I'll get a whole week, but just for those of you who are operating in vastly different time zones, and obviously there's a lot of, everybody's got kind of personal concerns going on just now. So I kind of wanted to push for the most lenient time window I thought I could get away with. And hopefully I'll be successful in that. And as for the nature of the exam itself, for those of you who've never done a take-home exam, and certainly none of you will have done one under these circumstances, what will basically happen is the exam paper will be the one I've already written. It'll be 3 essay questions, and you guys will have to provide a response to the 3 questions that you choose. Obviously, I'm not expecting kind of brilliantly tailored full formal micro essays. And for the sake of fairness, I'll be capping the limit at sort of 1,000 words a question, just to make it, just to introduce some kind of standardization to make it as fair as possible. And yeah, I won't be expecting, anything like kind of full citations or bibliographies. If you can cite the source that you're talking about, because you've got maybe a little bit more time, a little bit more access to information, that'd be great. But I'm certainly not expecting like full bibliographies or anything like that. I'm noticing the number of viewers kind of just dropped off and came back up a bit. And Tom, yeah, getting some buffering now. Okay, sorry about that. I think it's just that there's general kind of high demand on the internet right now, as you guys can imagine. Okay, sorry, I'm just trying to see what I can do to maybe try and improve the connection. Just bear with me a second. Okay, now hopefully that should improve it. I've just kind of moved position and plugged in an Ethernet cable, which I probably ought to have done from the beginning. Sorry about that. So hopefully that should improve connectivity. If you guys can let me know if when you hear this, whether that's made a difference, I'd be grateful. Thank you very much. In the meantime, getting on with the rest of Tom's point, was wondering the likelihood of any specific NATO state to be hesitant to Article 5 if Russia invaded the Baltic states. I'm guessing that was surely which has, and then kind of the comment cuts off, which has just reminded me the chat setting is limited to 200 characters. It's barely better than Twitter, really. So if you've got longer questions, you're just going to have to break them up into a couple of comments. Just FYI. So good, so excellent, excellent. Glad to hear it. To address the first bit of that question, though, the likelihood of when it comes to the likelihood of specific member states being hesitant, well, to trigger, so a state that was under attack is the one that you would expect to trigger it. Although, mind you, the one time it has been triggered as a result of 9/11, the European states triggered Article 5 as a sort of a political solidarity move with the US. So it doesn't have to be the state under attack per se, but in this particular context, one would expect it to be. And after it's been triggered, that's down to the kind of the other members of the alliance to respond. And as for the response of individual member states, well, it's worth remembering a lot of newer states or smaller states have very sort of limited capabilities. So you would kind of expect them to, to have kind of limited contributions. Obviously, we're not expecting kind of stunning contributions from places like Iceland, which doesn't have a functioning military, or Montenegro, which recently joined NATO in 2018, I believe, or Slovenia, places like this. But with talking about specific states, I mean, Germany would be a questionable one, of course, because it would be in a very rocky position of having to choose whether or not to kind of support NATO, support kind of transatlantic and European solidarity, measured against the risks to its economy and to its future national interest in terms of trading with Russia, in terms of energy supplies, and indeed any nation that is very kind of reliant on Russian energy supplies is going to be quite vulnerable here. And a lot of states do maintain a kind of energy reserve, usually of a couple of months. This is an EU mandated thing, but it's very, very difficult to quickly kind of change and diversify one's energy supply, especially when it comes to non-fungible sources like natural gas. So that's going to be a big factor, which is going to make a lot of, especially kind of Western European states, hesitate. Because ultimately, the cold hard national interest calculations will go on, and there will be concerns as to whether this is ultimately so important to the nation's long-term security, and by this I mean the alliance, that it's willing to risk incredible short-term pain in sort of getting into a direct conflict with Russia, or even risking getting into a direct conflict with Russia. That hesitancy would agree. And to take an example from the current coronavirus experience, for anyone who was doubting whether or not brutal national interest is alive in the European states, there are reports coming in, and I'll try and find a couple of examples of it, of basically countries requisitioning medical supplies which were destined for other nations. So I believe, one second. Yeah, so to take an example, there's this story coming out of France that French border guards have seized a couple of lorries containing like 130,000 face masks, and that were meant to be kind of bound for Britain. And there's been a lot of this stuff's unconfirmed, but there have been rumors that this is going on across Europe with countries basically requisitioning medical supplies for their own interest. And I certainly have no problem believing these stories because, this is what one would expect. Governments look out for their national interest. And this sort of behavior could well happen in an even higher stakes crisis if we're talking about potentially getting into a conflict with a nuclear armed power. Simonis, I thought it was from my part, but this okay. Yeah, that's the connectivity thing. Yeah, I think. Well, hopefully, I think that's all fixed now. Pavel, a core question: is it in Russia's interest to invade the Baltics? No. In the short term, certainly no. And where I was coming from kind of positing this scenario in the lecture comes from two things. One, in this sort of rush to kind of reorientate NATO towards its traditional European goals, a massive threat assessment was conducted. And whilst not necessarily likely, because it would be incredibly risky for Russia, this was identified as one of those major threats. So whilst it's unlikely, it was still plausible enough to be considered a real problem. And this is the activity of defense staff the world over, planning for low probability but potentially devastating events. And particularly with a view to kind of looking at whether or not circumstances might change and it might become in Russia's interests to do so. Which kind of brings me to my second point. Things change. Things are fluid. If it comes to a position where Russia really does not consider NATO to be a credible threat because NATO's credibility suffers an enormous shock in some way. And a few examples of that I outlined in the lecture of, say, sudden US disengagement, possibly in the aftermath of, say, coronavirus. A lot of Western nations are going to be economically devastated. I don't think is too strong a word. Defense cuts are kind of the usual first victim of government spending cuts in this regard. And there'll certainly be a very low appetite for any sort of military intervention. So if that translates into kind of a decreasing in NATO's credibility, it might kind of it might inspire kind of recalculation on the part of the Kremlin, because NATO disappearing would absolutely be in the Kremlin's interests. And that would be the goal of aggression towards the Baltics. It wouldn't be for the sake of taking the Baltics. The idea that Russia wants the Baltics back as some sort of buffer zone really doesn't make sense, because it doesn't kind of provide a buffer zone. And it's it's a strategically vulnerable part of the world to have to protect. Sure, it would kind of relink Kaliningrad with kind of the greater contiguous sort of Russian area, but then they'd have to occupy what would be ultimately very, very hostile countries, so they'd have a long insurgency to deal with and that sort of thing. So it wouldn't be for the sake of retaking the Baltics. It would be for the sake of shattering NATO. That's really where the Russian interest here lies. And if they perhaps perceived an opportunity to do so, it might be tempting. Likewise, if there's a change in government to the more sort of hardcore Eurasianist elements, and if you're not familiar with that term, I suggest you look it up. But this is kind of the really sort of hardcore kind of grand or greater Russia ideologues, basically, who have some kind of influence in the Russian state now, and may, if Putin's successor was to come from this faction, you might see a far more belligerent foreign policy, and maybe a far more kind of risk accepting foreign policy. And likewise, as a kind of to flip that on its head, if Russia was in a position where it was looking at a period of potential protracted decline, combined with the fact that NATO kind of looked less credible, there might be an incentive to act preventatively and try and use the kind of the opportunities that exist before a period of decline, say as a result of kind of economic decline based on their kind of very narrow economy, being so subject to kind of oil shocks in oil and gas and so on and so forth. It could be a sort of a desperate gamble almost. I mean, again, you generally don't find this happens very often in geopolitics because by and large, state level actors tend to be on the more risk averse side of things. But if you have a particularly influential leader who happens to be incredibly kind of risk acceptant, these things can happen. So, Pavel, I hope I've answered your question there. But if there's anything else you want me to cover, by all means, please go for it. Sorry for the dead air there. I was just looking for some other kind of talking points to go to just while you guys type in a few more points, comments, questions, that sort of thing. But just as much as you can get in is great. Oh, and like I was saying, I'll put out an announcement for kind of time and date for the revision session. But I was thinking of maybe trying to do it a bit earlier because I'm aware that there's a couple of you maybe went back to who are from like US, Canada, who maybe have went home, and if that's the case, this might not be kind of the best time window, 3 o'clock GMT. So if that's the case, I'm willing to do it a few hours earlier next time if that would be better for any of you. And obviously, this video or this stream is going to be saved up to this channel, so you can come back and review it whenever you like. Oh, and if you guys could email me as well with anything you want me to cover in the revision session, I don't mind going for a bit longer than an hour, which is kind of what we're going to do today. It's just going to be a regular tutorial. But rather than just trying to kind of condense the whole course into an hour or so, it would be useful if I had some feedback from you guys on what you'd like me to really cover in detail. That said, I probably will give a full course overview as well because not necessarily going into everything in depth, but just kind of a kind of macro uh, overview, just so that everything links up together. Because the end part of the course is meant to really weave together everything that we've been talking about in successive weeks into understanding not just crises, but uh, to use everything we've learned in terms of looking at actors, looking at their dynamics, looking at theory, looking at specific extraneous issues present in a region to kind of get an overall picture of regional security. And I'm not really sure if that's come over as well, because obviously I've not been able to get your guys' feedback in person, either through the lectures or through tutorials. So I just want to make sure that that's kind of come across okay, and you guys are all comfortable with that. And actually, just to get your own takes on this, what do you think the effects of maybe the aftermath of this coronavirus will be on geopolitics in terms of perhaps the West's relationship with China, Russia's relationship with Europe, especially given that we're experiencing a massive drop in oil prices, almost comparable to the kind of to what we saw in 2014. Certainly, it's undone a lot of the kind of price increases that had been building since then. What do you think the kind of the consequences will be for the EU as well? Because this seems to have very much defaulted, or handling of this crisis seems to have very much defaulted to the nation state level. And whilst there's been calls from Brussels for kind of a coordinated European response, even with regard to Germany, this seems to have fallen largely on deaf ears. So I'd be interested to hear what you guys hear, so to speak, what you guys think on that. Just to let you know, I'm still here. I'm looking for a couple of things to maybe cover, but if yeah, if you guys want to just type in a few responses to that, like what are your own thoughts European, well, on kind of this future of European security might be. It doesn't necessarily have to be related to the coronavirus, but anything that you can think of that might be, or your own thoughts or takes, would be great. And to kind of fill the dead air, I just need as much participation as possible. So yeah, ask away, guys, by all means. I'm just looking at some of the other black swans I posted as possibilities on the lecture slides. And even with the events of kind of the last few months, some of these, seem more likely or less likely. So it just goes to show you that even kind of the idea of trying to predict black swans can be very, very uncertain. So I'm thinking especially of kind of the European strategic autonomy question. And with that kind of sidelining almost of the European Union, it's made the odds of kind of a massive shift towards federalism appear more remote than they were even kind of at the end of last year. And likewise, the kind of question of British nuclear disarmament and withdrawal from NATO, again, looked far more likely before the last election, especially if a Labour minority government had got in that relied on kind of a vote and supply arrangement with the SNP, or potentially, another independence referendum happening quite quickly. These would be the major catalysts uh, to a potential British nuclear disarmament. But that sort of just seems kind of far more remote than it did even a little while ago. Ah, I think we're having a bit of a technical problem here. I just tried to type something in the chat and it came up as error. Try again. The last thing that's appearing for me is Pavel's comment about Russia's interest in invading the Baltics. Oh, bugger. I'm sorry for any posts that have been made after that, which I've missed. Okay, I'll try posting that again. Hi, Reb. Yeah, yeah, I've just noticed the tab with my university email open in it has crashed as well, which is why I didn't receive that. But I've just gotten your one there. So does anybody? Do you guys want to try maybe reposting a couple of points? Hello. So I'll try and get my email open again. Hi, yeah, guys. I'm just seeing your emails through now. A few of you have gotten in touch. Uh, yeah, okay. Sorry about that little technical hiccup there. I'm not sure what went wrong. I think the internet just threw a fit again. Uh, right. Well, that's a bit of an unfortunate end towards the. A bit of an unfortunate end there. Pavel, I've just noticed that you've very helpfully screenshotted me some stuff, so I'll get to one of these, and then we'll be just about out of time. Uh, Tom, unrelated, not sure if it was mentioned, but oh yeah, essay feedback. Thank you very much for that. Great point. Uh, yes, so I'll be sending. I'm really sorry. It's been a bit delayed with everything going on. It's all been a bit sixes and sevens. Hopefully you'll have the grades released to you pretty soon. Sort of next couple of days, or at the very latest after the weekend. I'm sorry about that. You'll have access. Should have access to your grades. But as I've marked them through hard copy scripts, all your feedback is currently sitting on my desk. So I'll maybe I'll try and get some way around that. But you could have a bit of a wait for your hard copy feedback. But grades should be with you soon. Tom, I've already seen an article stating that the UK refused to buy ventilators alongside the EU due to Brexit. Wow, that's. I mean, I'd like to see some. I'd like to see that actually, because that just sounds ridiculous. Very short-sighted. Rob, I was just saying a lot more discourse has emerged regarding how communist states like China have been responding to the COVID crisis, their care of citizens, etc., versus the US response. Yes, it's thrown authoritarianism into pretty stark relief, really, all this, hasn't it? I mean, there's been all sorts of kind of horror stories coming out. A lot of it can't be verified, of course, but yeah, certainly I wouldn't want to have experienced this in China. Um, yeah, so that kind of last couple of points I was just going to address. Again, thanks, Pavel, for that screenshot. The EU can only do what member states allow it to do. That's absolutely an excellent point. Yeah, but that's precisely it, isn't it? The EU can only be as effective as its consensus allows it to be, and that consensus model is a real hamper to kind of effective, quick, streamlined decision making, especially in times of crisis, which is perhaps why we've seen the EU being kind of unable to respond effectively to a lot of crises that it's been confronted with. And as with regard to the reading question, yeah, the war game identified a 2-week NATO military presence in the Baltics to stop Russia from getting to Tallinn or Riga in less than 60 hours. Has NATO boosted its capabilities? No, they have not. Partially because the forces that would be required to prevent that are enormous. I mean, we'd be talking about serious kind of permanent rotational deployment of basically the kind of force, the kind of numbers of troops comparable to those that were based in kind of Afghanistan and Iraq throughout kind of the height of the occupation, and also these would be sort of real kind of high end military hardware as well. So you would find it kind of falling disproportionately on the US too. And also it would be seen as incredibly provocative. Putting forces that could genuinely, combat the Russian Western Military District would be seen as a dramatic escalation and could kind of destabilize things further. And also, you've got the risk as well that if you put these troops there, how do you keep them supplied and reinforced if that A2AD network is still there? So you're just potentially putting even more of your best capabilities at risk. Tom, I've heard some interesting stuff regarding disinformation sent to top Chinese officials. Yep. Yeah, I'd be I mean, as somebody who kind of deals with data as part of my research, even at the best of times during crises like this, data and accurate data is going to be hard to come by, and that's true of even open societies for whole hosts of reasons. A lot of hospitals are going to be stretched to breaking point dealing with the cases in front of them to be providing kind of lots of accurate facts and figures for one thing. So yeah, I'd be taking the numbers coming out of most places with a pinch of salt, but from and examining kind of the Chinese government's behaviors in sort of past outbreaks, so looking at kind of SARS and bird flu, yeah, I'd be taking it with a massive, massive kilo of salt. Okay, guys, so I'm gonna stop it there, and thank you very much for all coming along. I'll not hit the end stream button straight away because I know that cuts things off quite abruptly for you guys. But yeah, this was great. I'm sorry about the kind of technical hiccups. Hopefully that goes better when we do our revision session, and I'll be dropping an announcement about that. And finally, yeah, you'll have your grades back hopefully tomorrow, if not Monday latest. Thank you for your patience and your forbearance. I know it's been a difficult time, and I hope you're all staying safe. I hope you're all kind of keeping your spirits up, and yeah, just keep buggering on as best you can, basically. Thank you very much, and I will see you next time.